This morning, we start with trial number 3, where the sentencing of Jesus took place. By law, there was to be a buffer of 24 hours between the conviction and the sentencing of an individual. In Jesus' case, it was only 2. After his appearance before Annas, it appears the leaders put Christ into a holding area, possibly placing him in a dungeon nearby. We don't know if he had food or water, but he sat there for at least 2 hours. Then they brought him out for sentencing. Scripture tells us, at daybreak, all the elders of the people assembled, including the leading priests and the teachers of religious law. Jesus was led before this high council, and they said, "Tell us, are you the Messiah?" But he replied, "If I tell you, you won't believe me. And if I ask you a question, you won't answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated in the place of power at God's right hand." They all shouted, "So you are claiming to be the Son of God?" And he replied, "You say that I am." "Why do we need other witnesses?" they said. "We ourselves heard him say it." Here it is, 5 o'clock in the morning, and Jesus is brought back to the court for sentencing. They said to him, "Now let's go through this one more time. Are you the Messiah?" He responds with an answer that at first seems a bit confusing. He says, "If I should tell you, you wouldn't believe." Of course, he was right. Though these leaders of Israel were familiar with Psalms 22, Isaiah 53, and other Old Testament prophecies that spoke of the Messiah, they didn't recognize that God's anointed stood before them. Instead, they were looking for a Messiah who would destroy the Roman Empire, then immediately rule for 1,000 years. They weren't buying this "die for the sins of the people" bit. In essence, Christ was saying, even if I tell you what the Messiah is really like, you won't believe me. Then he continued, "If I should ask you a question, you won't answer me." This was not Jesus' first encounter with these guys. Throughout his ministry, he'd talked with them many times about this very subject. He knew their hearts were hardened. Then the leaders said to Jesus, "So you are the Son of God." If they could catch Jesus blaspheming God's name, they would be just in putting him to death. Blasphemy was a capital offense under the law. Of course, Jesus wasn't blaspheming, and both his life and words proved that fact. The leaders, however, chose to ignore his teachings and his miracles, his power, and the fact that he fulfilled the Old Testament messianic prophecies. They were blind to the truth of his claims. Thus, they relegated him to the status of a simple mocker and blasphemer. When Jesus answered truthfully by saying, "It's just as you say, I am," the leaders found what they were looking for. They stood up and cried, "He deserves to die," and then grabbed him and bound him and took him to the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate. During Jesus' trial in the courtroom, a different drama was unfolding outside the city gates. Do you remember Judas, "How can you do this, Iscariot"? He'd had his moment in the sun, and now he was failing. Matthew's gospel tells us, when Judas, who had betrayed him, realized that Jesus had been condemned to die, he was filled with remorse. So he took the 30 pieces of silver back to the leading priests and the elders. "I have sinned," he declared, "for I have betrayed an innocent man." "What do we care?" they retorted. "That's your problem." Then Judas threw the silver coins down in the temple and went out and hanged himself. Evidently, Judas had been following the trial of Jesus to see the outcome of his betrayal. When Judas saw that Jesus was going to be put to death, he had a change of mind. He realized that his actions played a big part in the innocent Christ being tortured and sentenced to die. Overcome with remorse, Judas sought relief from the priests and elders, but found none. Instead of being truly repentant and asking God for forgiveness, he was overcome with guilt and despondency. Judas fled the temple, found a tree, and hanged himself. What a tragic end for Judas Iscariot. We now come to one of the greatest confrontations in the Bible. that between Jesus Christ and a Roman governor named Pontius Pilate. This is Jesus' first civil trial and his fourth overall since his arrest. The Jewish leaders hated Pilate, and they despised the fact that they had to seek his permission to put Jesus to death. Yes, they had passed their own judgment, but the Romans had the last word in imposing the death penalty. Even worse, it was now Passover weekend, a time of heightened political and social tension. The leaders knew Pilate would be cautious during this major Jewish holiday. Have no doubt, Pilate hated the Jews as much as they hated him. On top of that, Pilate was feeling pressure from his boss, the Roman Caesar Tiberius. Tiberius was a cruel and paranoid man, known to kill people for the slightest offense. This meant that Pilate and the other provincial governors were subject to the whims of a crazy man. Tiberius would often enjoy making his governors look foolish and had the power of life and death over each of them. The fact that Pilate was ruler over Jerusalem meant that he must have been low on the totem pole of authority and power in Rome, because Jerusalem was the least favored outpost by the Romans. So here they are in Pilate's courtyard, early in the morning. On one side were the Jewish leaders, and the other was Pilate, with Jesus stuck between them. Scripture tells us Jesus' trial before Caiaphas ended in the early hours of the morning. Then he was taken to the headquarters of the Roman governor. His accusers didn't go inside because it would defile them, and they wouldn't be allowed to celebrate the Passover. So Pilate, the governor, went out to them and asked, "What is your charge against this man?" "We wouldn't have handed him over to you if he weren't a criminal," they retorted. "Then take him away and judge him by your own law," Pilate told them. "Only the Romans are permitted to execute someone," the Jewish leaders replied. This fulfilled Jesus' prediction about the way he would die. At first, everything goes smoothly. Pilate says to the leaders, "What charge do you have against him?" They didn't have a charge, though. They didn't want to tell Pilate, "See this pathetic, bleeding Jew right here? He says he's God, and that makes us mad." If they'd started with that, Pilate would have told them to take their hocus-pocus religion and get lost. No, they didn't have formal charges, so they had to ad lib. In essence, they said, "Look, Governor, we are the Supreme Court of Israel. Do you think we're here on Passover weekend because we want to be? Don't you think this is a little bit serious? Just give us the go-ahead to kill him." Pilate, however, was in no mood to play their game. Besides, this was a great opportunity for him to stick it to the Jews, who he despised. So he told the leaders, "You have your own law. Do what you have to do." This forced the leaders to say, through their teeth, "We aren't permitted to put anyone to death." They must have hated this, having to admit that they were subject to Roman law. They didn't realize, though, that by seeking a Roman death penalty, they were actually helping fulfill prophecy. According to John's Gospel, Jesus said, "And when I am lifted up from the earth, I will draw everyone to myself." He said this to indicate how he was going to die. Did you know that if the Jews had killed Jesus instead of the Romans, Christ would not have been crucified for your sins? He would have been stoned to death. Stoning would have resulted in a quick death, and the work Jesus did on the cross would not have been completed. At this point, the Jewish leaders began accusing Jesus. They began to state their case. "This man has been leading our people astray by telling them not to pay their taxes to the Roman government and by claiming he is the Messiah, a king." The chief priests and elders continued making many accusations against Jesus, but he didn't reply. Scripture goes on to tell us, "But when the leading priests and the elders made their accusations against him, Jesus remained silent." "Don't you hear all these charges they are bringing against you?" Pilate demanded. But Jesus made no response to any of the charges, much to the governor's surprise. The first two of these charges, being a bad influence and not paying taxes, weren't going to work with Pilate because all Jews were trying to renege on paying taxes to Caesar. The third accusation, however, got Pilate's attention, saying he was the Messiah, a king. You can just see Pilate's wheels turning. A king? There's only one king, Caesar. What will happen if Tiberius finds out that on Passover weekend, of all weekends, there was a man walking around claiming to be king? After all, this is the one weekend each year when the Jews celebrate their freedom from the Egyptians. Pilate didn't want them talking about freedom from Rome. For sure, this third charge got Pilate's attention. But Jesus gave Pilate a surprise. Pilate was used to people groveling before him, pleading for mercy. After all, he had the power to sentence them to crucifixion, one of the cruelest ways to die. Pilate had seen people cry, lie, plead, curse. You name it, he'd seen it. But there was Christ standing before him in total dignity, remaining silent while the charges poured in against him. Sure, he was beaten and bleeding, and his hair was matted from sweat and blood mixed together. But still, he denies Pilate's demand that he defend himself. Standing calmly, Jesus doesn't utter a word. As crude as Pilate was, he was also smart. He decided to take Jesus inside where the Jews wouldn't follow. He wanted to talk with Jesus one-on-one. John's Gospel tells us, then Pilate went back into his headquarters and called for Jesus to be brought to him. Are you the king of the Jews? He asked him. Jesus replied, is this your own question, or did others tell you about me? Am I a Jew? Pilate retorted. Your own people and their leading priests brought you to me for trial. Why? What have you done? Jesus answered, my kingdom is not an earthly kingdom. If it were, my followers would fight to keep me from being handed over to the Jewish leaders. But my kingdom is not of this world. Pilate said, so you're a king? Jesus responded, you say I am a king. Actually, I was born and came into the world to testify to the truth. All who love the truth recognize that what I say is true. Pilate must have thought to himself, you've got to be kidding. Is this some sort of joke? He wasn't mocking Jesus as much as he was mocking the Jews who brought Jesus to Pilate. By this time, Pilate is in no mood to discuss truth. He spins and heads back to the crowd, yelling back over his shoulder, hey buddy, what is truth? This proud Roman had no doubt heard philosophers talk about truth and had come to the conclusion that searching for truth was useless. Tragically, he turned away from the only person who could have shown him ultimate truth. Jesus was telling him, I am the way, the truth, and the life. The Jews had accused Jesus of being a threat to the Roman Empire. Pilate, after interviewing Jesus, was convinced he was no threat at all. In fact, he considered the charges brought against Jesus to be absurd. After all, how could this pitiful peasant Jew, beaten, worn down, near collapse, be a threat to the mighty Roman machine? He was no threat. Pilate knew it, Jesus knew it, and the Jews knew it. So Pilate went outside to tell the Jews exactly what he thought. Basically, he wanted to tell them to take a long walk off a short pier. Pilate turned to the leading priests and to the crowd and said, I find nothing wrong with this man. Then they became insistent, but he is causing riots by his teachings wherever he goes, all over Judea, from Galilee to Jerusalem. When Pilate heard them mention Galilee, his ears perked up. Why? Pilate didn't rule over Galilee. A guy named Herod did. And guess who happened to be in town that weekend? You guessed it, Herod. So Pilate did what any self-seeking pagan ruler would do. He decided to lateral this political time bomb over to Herod. With friends like Pilate, you wouldn't need enemies. Scripture records Pontius Pilate's reaction. Oh, is he a Galilean? Pilate asked. When they said that he was, Pilate sent him to Herod Antipas, because Galilee was under Herod's jurisdiction, and Herod happened to be in Jerusalem at that time. Herod was delighted at the opportunity to see Jesus because he had heard about him and had been hoping for a long time to see him perform a miracle. He asked Jesus question after question, but Jesus refused to answer. Meanwhile, the leading priests and the teachers of religious law stood there shouting their accusations. Then Herod and his soldiers began mocking and ridiculing Jesus. Finally, they put a royal robe on him and sent him back to Pilate. Herod and Pilate, who had been enemies before, became friends that day. See, Herod was a godless man, so much so that he'd stolen his brother's wife and made her Mrs. Herod. That's fairly serious when you rip off your brother's wife. Herod was the one who arrested John the Baptist and put him in jail. Herod was a spooky, religious guy, and sometimes he'd bring John out of prison in order to talk with him. One day, he did this, and there sat Mrs. Herod on the throne next to her husband. The prophet looked straight into Herod's eyes and said, "It is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife." This made Mrs. Herod very upset. You probably know the rest of the story. Mrs. Herod used the seduction of her daughter to manipulate Herod into beheading John the Baptist. When Jesus heard that John the Baptist was dead, he went away and prayed. He loved John the Baptist. In fact, he once said, "In all humanity, there's no one greater than John." Jesus was fully aware that Herod was an evil man. Herod was both superstitious and godless. Herod was excited to meet Jesus, though. He was hoping to see some miracles. He wanted to see magic tricks like some cheap entertainment at the circus. But Jesus didn't comply. Herod continued to press for entertainment by asking questions. Where are you from? Did you really do such and such miracle? Did you really raise Lazarus from the dead? On and on it went, but Jesus stood calmly without saying a word. After a while, this became awkward. Herod realized he didn't want to get mixed up with this political hot potato, so he mocked Jesus by having his soldiers pretend to worship him. Herod got a few cheap laughs, then sent Jesus back to Pilate. Well, that brings us to the final session of our video series. The series will wrap up on Easter Sunday at Freedom Life Church. We'll start with Jesus' third civil trial and move through his crucifixion. We hope that you'll join us there for the rest of the story. Church starts at 10:30 Sunday morning. See you there.